Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Filiz Çakır-Philip, and I am the curator here at the Aga Khan Museum. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you here to today's lecture, Meet the Fatimids with Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis. Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis has over 20 years of experience as a curator and senior advisor for museum and cultural projects, working with institutions including the National Museum of Scotland and Glasgow, and more recently, Ulrike served as co-director at the Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilization, as well as senior strategic advisor to the Sharjah Museum Department in the United Arab Emirates. Since September 2017, she is the Director of Collection and Public Programs at the Aga Khan Museum. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis to the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome. Thank you so much for coming out on this really horrible day. I hope we have a sunnier time in this auditorium. Before I start, I would just very much like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples who kept the land on which we are today safe and prosperous over many, many millennia. In particular, of course, most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, who considered this land as Turtle Island and were the guardians of a long, long history and culture on which we are now allowed to build, and we are grateful that we can share the land and share our cultures with them together today. So, today I would like you to meet the Fatimids. And really, these Fatimids were one of the most successful and splendid dynasties in Islamic history, and most certainly in the history of Egypt in particular. But who actually were they? How do we know about them through art and culture? And how did they themselves think about who they were? In answering these questions, of course, their name gives us the very first clue, because the Fatimids traced their family lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima, who also was married to his first cousin Ali, and from whom the line of successors that the Fatimids and the Ismailis, about whom I will tell you a little bit more later, descended. So, based on the fact that their lineage went back to the family of the Prophet, of course, they saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the Prophet and his message and his legacy, both in spiritual and religious terms and in societal and even political terms, as the rightful leaders of the Muslim community or Ummah at large. Historically, through the sources, we actually can trace the Fatimid movement back to the mid-9th century, when we hear about a certain Abdullah who emerges in the Khuzestan area of southwestern Iran, leading a rather covert religious movement that we now know as the Ismailis, named after a descendant of Fatma and Ali, Ismail bin Ja'far. The message of the movement already at the time was very much not only spiritual, of course, including righteousness, good governance, tolerance, and always the importance of seeking knowledge, but it was also political in that it claimed that the rulers of the Islamic world at the time, the Abbasid caliphs based in Baghdad, were in fact unjust usurpers, and the Fatimids promised to relieve the Islamic world of these usurpers and announced the expected arrival of a Messiah-like savior for the Ummah as a whole under the leadership of Fatima's descendants. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, that didn't go down very well with the authorities, and persecutions took place that forced the movement to change, if you like, base. So the Ismaili movement went from the Persian Gulf area, Basra and Khuzestan, to Salamiya. Let me see if I can get this pointer to work. Just there in Syria, southeast of Hama. From here, the Ismailis sent out missionaries all over Iran, into South Asia, into Yemen, and also very much into North Africa, preaching justice, preaching egalitarianism, the collaboration between religions for the benefit of a successful and harmonious community, and so on. And in North Africa, in particular, they managed to attract a lot of support from among the indigenous Berber communities that were very much put upon by the ruling Arab elites. Over the years, their success gently grew, and in 909, the Fatimids had established themselves so successfully that they could actually establish openly a counter-caliph, a counter-leader of the Islamic community in Raqada, in what is now Tunisia. And from there, they consolidated their power across North Africa, and then were able to build their first purpose-built, if you like, Fatimid capital in 921 at Al-Mahdiyya, southeast of Sus. Now, Al-Mahdiyya was followed by Al-Mansuriya a little bit later in 948, but Al-Mahdiyya was the first purpose-chosen site where the Fatimids would concentrate their rule, because obviously, although they had successfully established themselves now as the new rulers of those North African territories, they had a lot of enemies. And they had to be sure that where their administration and their palace were situated, the enemy powers could not reach them very easily. So, as you can see here, they chose a very, very suitable outpost just halfway between Sus and Sfax in modern Tunisia. And they covered this peninsula all around with solid walls, fortified with solid polygonal towers as well. They cordoned it off to the mainland with a gate, which is indicated by number 5 there. And although materially nowadays not a lot remains, we do have enough to get an idea of what the city inside looked like as well, with a palace, with a mosque, and with a substantial port, here shown as number 3, from which the Fatimids could launch their naval campaigns and, of course, also maintain the maritime commerce that helped to further strengthen their economic empire. We have a beautiful quote by a geographer and merchant at the time, Ibn Hawqal, who visited Al-Mahdiyya in the 940s, and he tells us that there were many palaces, fine residences and houses, baths and caravanserais. So it was a completely comprehensive setup. Now, of the archaeological remains we have, or actually remains of the time in general, the most important survival is the Mosque of Al-Mahdiyya. And in fact, that is the most important Fatimid monument in the whole of North Africa that still survives to a enough a degree for us to understand what was going on at the time. Today it's heavily restored, but nevertheless we can see that it is a traditional, nearly square mosque design with a large courtyard, a roofed prayer area with a dome marking the mihrab, the prayer niche at the back, and most interestingly, an entrance facade with a very triumphal portal, which is absolutely un-Islamic, and was most probably introduced under the inspiration of Roman triumphal arches, which also fitted very well with the Fatimids' increasing concentration on religious ceremonies and processions. At the same time, it is also interesting that we have a famous saying by the Prophet himself, who is supposed to have said, "I am the city of knowledge," and Ali, his cousin and Fatma's husband, is its gate. So there may also have been a symbolic reason for the decision to mark the entrance to the mosque with a very monumental portal, and this feature we will see again repeatedly as we look at the architectural heritage of the Fatimids. Palace, of course, palaces, as we said, were also a key feature of Al-Mahdiyya. And nothing is left of the complexes that were built, but we again know from the sources, very interestingly, that there were two palaces facing each other across a large square. So keep that in mind, we will come across that later again. And one of these palaces, the eastern one, was for the caliph, and the western one was for his successor, Al-Qa'im. So of the rare archaeological finds that can be associated with the Fatimid palace, we have first of all a very interesting little marble panel which shows you an enthroned princely or royal figure at ease with a very interestingly pointed crown that is actually much more typical of Eastern Islamic iconography at the time. And on the left, a flutist, obviously performing for the ruler at leisure. So when we look at the details of this panel, it's very interesting that the princely figure has been mutilated in later centuries, not the flutist. So that indicates that somebody later on came along, didn't agree with the Fatimids or their rulers, and wanted to make a point by mutilating the face. On the left, we have a little fragment of a mosaic floor, which again would have been in one of the palaces or houses of the elites. And here we very much see the influence of local late antiquity. And it already gives us an indication how the Fatimids were very, very happy to interact with the existing cultural and artistic legacy, but also with the artisans, the craftsmen that were available on the ground in order to express visually and materially the ideas and the ideologies that they were ascribing to. Now, as I said, in 948, the court moved again to Al-Mansuriyya, named after the caliph of the time. And this capital was located south of Qayrawan, and absolutely nothing remains. But again, the sources help us, and the interesting thing is that according to the sources, the ground plan of the city was round. And the only other city at that time that was round was Baghdad, which was the capital of their great competitors, the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad in Iraq. So the theory goes that this approach might have been taken in order to openly defy and provoke those in power in the East. We also have beautiful descriptions of this city. So, for example, the 10th century geographer Al-Maqdisi says, "The city is rounded like a cup, and there's no other place like it. The ruler's house is in the center of the city, just as in Baghdad, and water runs through the middle of it. Very well populated, it has excellent markets within which stands the congregational mosque of the ruler. The width of the city wall is 12 cubits, and it is separated from the buildings of the city. For between them and it is a space, the width of a road. The gates of the town are Bab al-Futuh, the gate of triumphs, Bab Zuela, the gate of the Zuela tribe, and Bab Wadi al-Qasrain, the gate of the valley of the Fullers. All these gates are reinforced with iron, and the walls are of baked brick jointed with lime." So we are very lucky in this period that we have eyewitness reports remaining that give us an idea of what is materially lost today. Now, Al-Mansur made a lot of changes compared to his predecessor because his palace city was much more luxurious, was much more dedicated to splendor, because the first capital had been relatively pragmatic with a focus on administration and military activity. But now, because the empire was very much consolidating and one had to keep up with the Joneses, certain court ceremonial splendor and performance was kind of introduced into royal life. Among the innovations, too, were a new coinage. Because up to that point, the Fatimid coins had, first of all, followed Abbasid models, then local Aghlabid models. And of course, all of these incorporate Quranic inscriptions into the front and back of the coin. But after 948, the design was changed to incorporate many more concentric circles, all filled with Quranic inscriptions that were very carefully and purposefully chosen. And later on, the inner circle only remains with the dot, which is the symbol of everything starting from a central point. And this design on the right will remain, in general, the typical design of Fatimid coins that were struck in North Africa, in Egypt, in Syria, and in Arabia for over 2 centuries. And they were also very much recognized for their very pure, very high gold content, which in turn was, of course, a symbol again of the Fatimids' power, wealth, and ability to strike coins of that high quality. The same aspirations for being seen at the same level as their competitors. And these, of course, were not only the Abbasids in the Islamic Empire, but also the Byzantines based on Constantinople. These aspirations, we know, were also expressed in the new support of luxury arts. And we have evidence in the form, for example, of a now dispersed luxury manuscript, a Quran manuscript, which is actually written on parchment, which was dyed with indigo, a very, very expensive dye at the time, and then written with gold lettering. And if you imagine the size of the page, each page, or let's say the text block of each page is around 19 by 29 centimeters, so quite big. The complete Quran would probably have had around 600 leaves in several volumes, so it was a major undertaking artistically, but also in terms of money. And the interesting thing is that the adoption of very rich materials of a dark blue or sometimes purple background and golden writing can already be found in pre-Islamic times amongst Byzantine manuscripts. And of course, don't forget the Byzantines also claimed to be the representatives of Christ on earth, i.e. the worldly representatives of, the Christian religion, let's say. So there was always an eye on being at the same level politically, secularly, but also in terms of religion. And within the context of Islam, blue or gold on blue is very symbolic in that it directly refers back to the first building that was built as a symbol of the faith's triumph in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which was completed in the late 7th century, and which you can see on the right-hand side, where a golden inscription on a blue ground is incorporated into the inside of the dome area of that particular building. Now, from Al-Mansuriyya, the Fatimids were preparing their next move, and of course their ultimate aim would have been Baghdad. That was their aspiration, and it was important to move back eastwards and first of all take over Egypt, which was one of the most powerful and economically successful provinces of the empire. So the Fatimids moved westwards successfully in 969. And interestingly, the Fatimid Caliph's general who led this expedition was an Armenian in origin, an Armenian Christian. And he first arrived in Alexandria with his fleet, with his troops, and with 93,500 kilos of gold in order to smooth the negotiations. And the dignitaries of the old capital in Egypt, Al-Fustat, which you can see here at the bottom, came to meet him, and a peace treaty was negotiated that was very much based on restoring peace, prosperity, laid down a commitment to tolerance and inclusivity, and which then allowed the Fatimids to move in properly. And when they arrived, they actually bypassed the old center and moved up northeast to establish a new encampment there, which Jauhar, this general who led this whole project, first of all called Al-Mansuriyya in reference back to the capital in Tunisia, where of course the Caliph was waiting for things to be prepared. And then when the Caliph arrived in 973, it was renamed into Al-Qahira al-Mu'azziyya, that means the victorious city of Al-Mu'izz, of the Caliph. So this new center was built up to start with as a military encampment with a brick wall around it, and the troops that had come were lodged in particular neighborhoods according to their regimental affiliations, and then at the heart of it, one set about building yet another palace complex. Now again, we have nothing left as such, so here you are looking at a reconstruction, and the sources tell us that we had a greater eastern palace, which was completed in 973, faced across a large square and along a north-south axis by a western palace. And just like in Al-Mansuriyya, it was the eastern palace that belonged to the Caliph, and the western palace was associated with, if you like, the crown prince. Now, the system of two palaces facing each other also incorporated all the government departments. So in the Eastern Palace, we would have had libraries, treasuries, ministries, etc. And we also know that at the heart of the Eastern Palace, there was a massive throne room with a solid golden and gem inlaid throne and decorations of hunting scenes. The Western Palace, which was smaller and slightly less sprawling than the Eastern one, was built between roughly 975 to 6 and then expanded several times. And it's more regular and, as you can see, centered around courtyards and areas that resemble pavilions, and of course there were gardens as well. And below these palaces, there were underground passages where people on their horses could move unobserved to and fro. The Fatimids also established burial grounds in the southern part of the palace complex, so everything was set up for both, if you like, religious or spiritual and political rule and ceremony. So a life of splendor happened within these palace walls, and the sources tell us that there were treasuries full of gems, of textiles, of gold and silver, of rock crystal, etc., but nothing really remains very much, because when the economic situation and the political situation of the time became very flawed, in the mid-11th century, parts of the treasury were looted, and then, of course, after the dynasty fell in 1171, everything was dispersed. So the exhibition that we have on in the museum at the moment really gives you a very, very rare opportunity to come face to face with some of the outstanding masterpieces that do still survive from those days. Now, we know that the palace interiors were very richly decorated with carved marble. We know there were carved wooden panels for the walls, for doors, for upper walls and ceilings. There were textiles, precious materials, and other luxurious elements incorporated. And we have, again, an eyewitness report by an Iranian polymath and scholar, Nasir al-Khosrow, who visited Fatimid Cairo in the mid-11th century. And he says, a dais was placed the entire length of the building at a height of 4 ells, on 3 sides, all of gold, with hunting and sporting scenes depicted thereon, and also an inscription in marvelous calligraphy. All the carpets and pillows were of Byzantine brocade and buqalamun, an iridescent textile, each woven exactly to the measurements of its place. There was an indescribable lattice-work balustrade of gold along the sides. Behind the dais and next to the wall were silver steps. The dais itself was such that words do not suffice to describe it. Other furniture, apart from the throne, which incidentally was also studded with 1,560 precious stones, appears to have been inlaid with ivory, both elephant ivory and hippopotamus ivory, from East Africa and from Mali. And the scenes, of which I give you here a little impression, were carved very, very finely, and again incorporate styles that bring together the artistic traditions of pre-Islamic local Coptic Christian traditions, of Mediterranean traditions, of Byzantine traditions, and even of Eastern Iranian traditions. So just studying the artifacts tells us how interested the Fatimids were and how open in engaging with the best art forms and the best traditions that were available at the time. We see a lot of animal figures and also a lot of human figures, which in the context of Islamic art as a whole is relatively rare in terms of the quantity and also the quality and the naturalism in which they were executed. And interestingly, we have an eyewitness report by a crusader who came to the palace and noted on the fact that the palace had menageries of real animals within its walls. So you actually can imagine that these figures and the animals we see actually also to some extent echoed their living manifestations. Now, I already mentioned precious textiles, so you have to imagine at that time palaces and the houses of the elite would not have had furniture in the sense that we have today. A lot would have been done on the floor with everything being covered with wonderful carpets and furnishings, cushions. There would have been curtain of silk and brocade covering the door entrances. So textiles played an enormously important role in Islamic society and Fatimid society, and many of them, again, were imported from as far afield as Spain and Constantinople or Iraq and Iran. And within the palace, an entire department was responsible for the upkeep of these textiles, including also royal tents, parasols, and saddlecloths. So it was a great responsibility. Yet another department was exclusively responsible for the costumes and the garments that the caliphs were wearing. And of course, again, the possession of different types of costumes and coverings and turban covers were in themselves an expression of power and wealth. So Egypt had had a long ancient tradition of weaving, again in the hands of the Coptic Christians, and the workshops were generally located within the Nile Delta or near the Mediterranean coast. And flax was, in Fatimid times, the main cash crop of the country, and the production of linen textiles the main industry. And that was a success, but it was also a short-sighted policy, because when the ecological crisis started happening and the weather turned bad or the Nile didn't deliver, these crops failed, and then the whole economy and therefore, of course, the government was in trouble. So in Fatimid times, these linen textiles were decorated with wool, with silk, and sometimes even with gold and silver threads. And those produced for the caliph would have had inscriptions naming the ruler, including religious blessings, dates, place of production, and so on. And the caliph and his court didn't only wear these garments daily and changed for special occasions and meetings and receptions or whatever, but they were also given as gifts of honor to deserving courtiers or to diplomats over the year. So you can imagine what amount of precious garments were used and were needed. So it really was an enormous industry, and we know that both the rulers and the high-class courtiers each owned thousands of pieces in their own collections. Today, of course, we only have, yet again, very few fragments remaining. And on top of the slide, I'm giving you some examples of the kind of Byzantine and Persian textiles that would have been used at the court. And below, I'm giving you on the right a little fragment that is associated with the Caliph Al-Aziz, who ruled between 975 and 96. And on the left, a piece that is also in our exhibition associated with the Caliph Al-Mu'izz. As I said, the linen costumes were mainly white or, let's say, undyed, but sometimes you can even get these really, really rare and expensive dyed examples like this turban cloth, which is dyed in indigo and has a silk tapestry inscription on it, again referring to the Caliph al-Aziz and actually giving us a particular place of production in Tinis in the Upper Nile Delta and a date, 987 to 990. So I already mentioned the luxury of the material culture at the Fatimid court, and among the pieces that were in the treasuries were 17,000 boxes of rock crystal items, jars, ewers, even basins. And the rock crystal was imported from places as far afield as Iraq, Iran, Sri Lanka, and even the land of the Franks, which basically means Europe. Rock crystal was very, very popular at the time because it was associated with paradise and the life of ease that was promised to the believers in paradise. Magical and medicinal properties were ascribed to it, and of course, as a material itself, it was very rare and very expensive. So if you could afford to have 17,000 boxes of the stuff in your treasury, you were a rich, rich man. Today, we only have some 200 pieces surviving, and I'm giving you some examples here: a little perfume box, a chess set. This might also have been used for ointment. And interestingly, most of the pieces that do survive are in royal or in church treasuries, because after the fall of the dynasty, many of these pieces were actually brought back to Europe by crusaders, and through the remote association with the Holy Land, these pieces were very, very much respected and then kind of reinterpreted in Christian spiritual contexts. We only have 3 items that can firmly be associated with a Fatimid personality in the late 10th and 11th century. So the most famous of them all perhaps is the ewer on the left, which is now in the treasury of San Marco in Venice, and it bears a dedicatory inscription to the Caliph al-Aziz. A similar ewer now in Florence in the Palazzo Pitti bears an inscription that refers to Al-Qa'id al-Quwad, so the leader of the leaders, if you like, which is a title that was borne by a particular Fatimid general, Hussein bin Jawhar, only between the year 1000 and 1008. And then finally, an amazing crescent ornament, which was later incorporated into a Christian reliquary, also to be seen up and close in our exhibition upstairs, is inscribed with the name of the Caliph al-Zahir, who ruled from 1021 to 1036. Now, of course, out with the palace walls, the Fatimids looked after their public and religious duties as well, and built a few very important congregational mosques as markers of Fatimid ideology and power. And the oldest one we have is also today the most famous one, Al-Azhar, instituted in 971 and possibly named after the Caliph's former mosque of this type in the old capital Al-Mansuriyah. Today, of course, it is very, very extensively restored, and there are only a few authentically Fatimid traces available for us to study now. Originally, again, it would have had a triumphal portal, as we already encountered in the mosques in North Africa, and no minaret, because the Ismailis would have just called for prayer from the roof. It was originally built from brick and then covered with stucco that was carved with decorations, and also, again, Quranic verses that would have expressed the particular theological and ideological points the Fatimids wanted to make. Of course, these kind of mosques are also continually cared for and restored. So a later ruler, Al-Hakim, not only donated very elaborately carved wooden doors from Turkish pine to the mosque in 1011, but also consolidated its prowess as a center of learning. And of course, it continues as that to this very day at the heart of Cairo. The next mosque we need to mention was started in 990 under the Caliph Al-Aziz, who ruled from 975 to 996. And he's a very interesting character because he had a vizier, so I guess a prime minister of Jewish origins, Yaqub ibn Kilis. And together they oversaw a period of great success and harmony for the society as a whole, and an age of prosperity in which women also were very much enabled to participate. And we know, for example, that Caliph Aziz's mother and his sister Sitt al-Mulk were very active in their own building projects of both religious and secular structures. So this mosque is now known as the Mosque of Al-Hakim. Oh, sorry. And it was originally out with the old original city walls, probably built again to serve for the Fatimid religious ceremonies and also processions, which they had started incorporating into their public life by that time. And studying the elements of it, again, a triumphal portal, a nearly square mosque precinct with a covered and domed prayer hall, and then two very curious minarets flanking the portal on either side. And of course, I just mentioned that we know from the sources that the Ismailis did not use minarets for their call to prayer. They just went onto the roof in the tradition of the Prophet. So there are some theories that suggest that these towers might just have been intended to symbolize and refer back to those towers that marked the mosque in the holy city of Mecca. Again, the mosque was decorated with carved stucco and wood, and was at the heart of Fatimid religious life. Now, just a little extra remark on the man who finalized it and who finally opened it in 1013, Al-Hakim, because he was also he was also famous for establishing a house of knowledge in the palace complex that actually incorporated also a public library that was open for everybody, with an expert staff trained to answer public inquiries, with paper and ink provided for anybody who wanted to come in and take copies, and who wanted to sit and study there. So this was a very open-minded project, perhaps also inspired by an earlier initiative in Baghdad. Sadly, Al-Hakim was also known for rather less positive influences in the Fatimid era, because he had to struggle with a lot of upheaval and violence among his troops and also in his society, and as a result he went to very stringent measures and very bad repercussions for particularly minorities and women at the time. And tragically, his ill-advised decision to destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem in 1009 was actually one of the reasons that helped to trigger the First Crusade, that then set off from Europe and captured Jerusalem for the Christians in 1099. From the mid-11th century, things started going bad for the Fatimids as political and economic crises started to mount and started to rock the foundations of the state. And in 1068, there was a major rebellion in Cairo, and many parts of the palace treasuries were plundered at the time. And that was the first time that luxury items started drifting into the market and disappearing into the world. And the caliph was now obliged much more to rely on his vizier, who became, if you like, both a political and a military commander. And in 1074, Badr al-Jamali, again a personality originally of Armenian Christian descent, took the power into his hands to re-establish order and also to reinforce the city of Cairo, which of course by that time had grown well beyond the original foundations. And he consolidated the walls with stone and also brought in Christian architects from Edessa to rebuild and consolidate the city walls. And we have here Bab al-Nasr, Bab al-Futuh, and Bab Zuwayla. And if you have listened and paid attention, you will have heard these names before, because they still hark back to some of the city gate names that we already found in Al-Mansuriya in the very beginning. So after this point, after the mid-11th century, the Fatimids still continued to hold on with an ever more shrinking sphere of influence for another 100 years. But their political power and their influence was really waning as the enemies around them grew ever more bold and attacked them really from both the sea and from the east over the years to remain. Now, while Cairo, Al-Qahira, was doing its thing, the old capital I briefly referred to at the beginning, Al-Fustat, of course continued to be a very important, if not the important, economic heart of Egypt. And of course this old capital had been the home of Jewish communities, of Christian Coptic communities, other Christian communities, and also to a lesser extent Muslim communities for a very, very long time. And the Fatimid caliphs left Al-Fustat to continue with their traditional activities, with their craftsmen and their artisans working with their international trade exchanges and so on. And it was a very vibrant and important hub. Of the objects we have remaining from that time, many would have been made in Al-Fustat, and most famous perhaps among the Fatimid arts we have today are a group of objects that are known as lusterware. It is a luxurious type of ceramic that had a shiny, had the decoration attached to the glaze with a shiny matter that was created of metal oxides and fixed in a second firing. And it would have been very much an elite ware. There would have been many, many other types of ceramics, much more numerous and much more embedded at all layers of society, but what is most famous today are these luster bowls. And of course, both Coptic and Muslim potters were involved in their production. And the interesting thing is that just the decoration of these bowls today can tell us so very much about the various styles that were at play at the time, and consequently how many different tastes, i.e., clientele's tastes, were around. So for example, if you look at the bowl on the top left, you will see a Coptic Christian monk swinging his incense burner, and to his right is a very strange symbol which actually goes back to an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph for life, which already in the pre-Islamic Coptic period was transformed into a Coptic cross, a tree of life symbol. So the fact that somebody could create such an expensive bowl with a Coptic Christian image also tells us that obviously that community was doing very well at the time. The plate at the bottom gives us an indication into what might have been going on during official events in Cairo, because if you look closely, there's a very beautifully spotted giraffe being led away, or rather pulled away, by its guard. And of course, giraffes, as well as elephants, we know from the sources, were an integral part of official Fatimid processions, but were also sent as diplomatic gifts all the way across the Mediterranean to Constantinople. Other styles, again, the eagle on the top right, of course, a very old royal and imperial symbol that was shared across the Mediterranean cultures, and at the bottom, a plate that very much more reminds us of Greek heritage. And perhaps not only visual arts, but also the literary arts, because we know at the time that Greek poetry, or let's say the legacy of Greek poetry and Greek animal fables, Greek stories, were very, very much embedded in the Fatimid culture. Metalwork, another important trade. And here we know that the Jewish community was very, very much involved in the design, the production, and the international trade of this medium. So in the old synagogue that still survives today within Al-Fastad, documents were found in the late 19th century that still harked back all the way to the Fatimid period. And in these documents, all the daily activities and the commercial activities of the Jewish community could be investigated in depth. And we know from these so-called Geniza documents that the Jewish traders had international networks already at the time, all the way to Iran and India. And we know that they would take orders for a particular vessel, for example, and they would send that order all the way to India and say, please make me a ewer that high, that big, the weight that much, must not cost more than this. And they would send it, and the thing would come back. So what we now associate with made in China was already a given over 1,000 years ago, and to the highest quality. And it is amazing how, without having an image or, sending an email or whatever, these orders were executed very, very precisely. To give you some example of the metalwork that is associated with the Fatimid period, we have on the left a hoard that was found in Palestine and is, due to stylistic details, datable to the 11th century, and then a very unusual and rare mirror back, which is also in our exhibition upstairs, which has a very unusual, beautifully worked silver covering, again with an inscription around the edges. Now, the most important art form that we would have had in Fatimid times, and of course not exclusively in Fatimid times, would have been the art of the book. Because traditionally in Islamic cultures, the oral arts, or the literary arts, the poetic arts, the arts of storytelling and fine literature was at the very heart of sophisticated society. Now we always think that cultural sophistication is expressed in material forms, in the visual arts, in the material arts, but at the time that was not the case. So we know again from historical sources that the Fatimids themselves, the caliphs themselves, their families and their courtiers were extremely interested in literature. They collected books. They had massive libraries with tens of thousands of books in their private libraries, never mind the palace libraries. And none of this remains. We do not have a single manuscript that we can actually attribute to that time and that place. So just really to make a case for what has been lost and to remind you that that would have been such an important area of activity, I've brought you a few examples of random drawings and manuscript fragments that we do still have today. And of course, little drawings like the lion or the tiger on the left would also have been used to inspire the images that you then again see on artifacts like the lusterware. So from the 10th century, when they started off, till the 12th century and their demise, the Fatimids maintained absolutely fascinating and very, very complex links with the wider world. So for start, and Cairo, as very complex metropolitan centers of world trade at the time, they would have had trade routes that went all the way into sub-Saharan and East Africa, down the Red Sea to Iran, to India, to China. They would have gone across the Mediterranean to Spain, to Sicily, to the emerging city-states of southern Italy, Amalfi, Pisa, Genoa, Venice, to Constantinople, and of course also to the Eastern Islamic world. And in the wake of all these constant interactions between the various countries and areas of what was already at the time a very globalized world, artifacts were sent and exchanged, artisans were sent and exchanged, and ideas were sent and exchanged. And you actually have evidence, particularly around the Mediterranean, of, let's say, a pan-Mediterranean culture that shared a lot of elements. So we have, for example, on the top left here, a Spanish ewer, but that was ultimately influenced by Fatimid metalwork prototypes. You have in the center a little detail of an incredible Norman chapel that was built for the Norman kings of Sicily, that is the successors, the Christian successors of the Fatimid rulers of Sicily in 1132. And the style that we have in the ceiling of this chapel is such that it is assumed that probably either Fatimid artisans were sent from Egypt or they were already based in Sicily and were continuing the Fatimid artistic and visual traditions in the service of a new ruler. So it's an absolute phenomenon that is also reflected in the elephant tusk or oliphant that we have in the gallery upstairs, which was probably used as a hunting horn or used during ceremonial occasions or even as a symbol of authority to start with. But its style is so kind of generic for the Mediterranean area at the time that scholars are still tearing their hair out and fighting over whether it was made in Fatimid Egypt or it was made in Sicily or it was made in southern Italy, because the styles at the time were so very similar, and even the function and the use of objects like that was shared in many respects. Finally, that little, again, luster dish you see on the left is a most fascinating symbol of the complex interactions that the Fatimids entered with the eastern part of the Islamic Empire and the world, because this luster bowl was actually made in probably Iraq or Iran. And of course, the luster technique first emerged in Basra, in southern Iraq. And then when things started going bad for these luxury craftsmen and the patronage started ebbing away, they had heard that somebody was setting up shop in Egypt that was very interested in luxury arts. So the theory is that the Iraqi potters picked up their trade secret of making these fascinating luxurious bowls and moved to Egypt. and continued their trade there. So the technique already came from Iraq to Egypt. But the shape that you see there already in turn is influenced by a contemporary, or slightly earlier perhaps, Chinese silver dish. So imagine how all these different cultures are coming together at the time already. And we always think that globalization only started in the 90s. So on that note, I hope I've given you a quick potted introduction into who the Fatimids were, what they did and what they left behind in terms of art and culture, which of course is our business here at the museum. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed yourself.